Hello, and welcome back to The Witch Source. Sorry for our hiatus. We had some things going on that we had to get taken care of so that we could get back to recording.
Too much.
Yes. Guilty parties know who they are, and we won't go into it any more than that. So we are picking up where we left off with this divine masculine. And so to get started with that, so we're going to start with, I was going to read a little story, picking up from where we left off with the Wheel of the Year, with the mythos, or one of the many, because there are many. Let me just throw that out there before somebody's like, that's not the right one. There are several. This was just one of my personal favorites. So let me just throw that out there before we get like hate mail. So yes, this is my favorite version of the solar god story mythos from the Wheel of the Year. And this basically came from one of my favorite authors, Raven Grimassi, and from his book, Witchcraft, a Mystery Tradition. I was trying to remember all this. Yes, and so funny thing I just want to throw out there. The other day, so stupid. Okay, so like we all know, right? Like my magical name is Raven. And if anybody's listened to the podcast or gone back, like you've heard the whole story, because when I like got that name when meditating, I was like, yeah, no fucking way. Like, no. And got absolute confirmation on that. So I was like, okay, I guess this is it. So I went with it. And it did not hit me until the last time we recorded, when we got done. I was like, wait a minute. Raven Grimassi. Oh my shit. My name's Raven too. Like, so fucking stupid. I literally never put the two together until after we recorded the last time. Like, we got done and I was getting ready for bed and like just thinking about shit, like running the episode through my head. And I was like, oh crap.
Here's the thing. I never put it together until you just said something.
Are you serious? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not the only one. Because I was just like, we've talked about it like a couple times when recording.
Yep.
And then it's like that literally that was nowhere in my brain when this came about. So hopefully I can honor and serve the name well, because that's like big shoes to fill. Just saying.
Oh yeah. Well, I know you'll do well.
I will try my best. That's all I can do, I guess. So, all right. So his version, obviously, I've shortened it to make it readable here. So I will go ahead and share that. Sorry, you guys. All right. So in the solar or divine masculine view of the Wheel of the Year, the sun god is born on the winter solstice, aka Yule, the longest night of the year. And it marks the beginning, oftentimes, obviously not for all traditions, but it marks the beginning of the Wheel of the Year in this mythos, because obviously, he's born. Now, at this point, he is still God, but he is in his infancy. So he's weak. And he's a child. So he's obviously very much dependent on the goddess at this point. But he is the child of promise, who promises to bring back the light, and therefore is the gift of hope from the divine. Now, this is a theme that we see often, right, in other religions. The promised child is born, and he's going to be the sun god, bringing back the lights, right? Okay. And so from this point forward, he starts to grow in strength. So obviously at this point, at the winter solstice, the days start to get longer and the nights start to get shorter. So as he is growing in strength, the sun is getting stronger, the days are getting longer. So he is bringing back that light. And this is his, basically his childhood as he's growing up. And then he goes through his rite of passage at Imbolc, also known as Candlemas. And this Imbolc is the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So it's at that, you think like, one of those pivotal points where things start to shift a little bit. And, there at the equinox, we have where the days are the same. There's that equal day, equal night. So from there, he moves into his adolescence, essentially. And that's marked by the spring equinox. And so he's moved from his rite of passage at Imbolc to now he's in his adolescence. It's the spring equinox, and he is carrying the seed of light to ensure rebirth for his death to come. So there's another little hint. He knows he's going to die, right? But then what? He's going to be reborn again. So again, a very common theme. This is nothing new. It's actually extremely old.
Very old.
At this point, he starts to seek out the goddess, and he finds her at Beltane, and we all know what Beltane is. Woo, it's the big party time, right?
Oh yeah.
So at this point at Beltane, the sun god then woos the goddess because she is the renewal of life, and their courtship essentially begins. And then their marriage actually is marked by the summer solstice. Again, we go back into the equal day and night. No, I'm sorry. Summer solstice is the longest day of the year. He is at his height. That is marking their marriage. And so then we move into, so he's also at his peak of strength, right? And so then he is sharing his marriage bed with the goddess, and essentially, helping ensure life will continue on, that people will be provided for. And so from here, the days then become shorter and his nights are filled with her. So the nights start to get longer, as he's spending more time with his goddess now at this point in his cycle, his wheel of the year. And then at Lammas or Lunasa, the sun god becomes the father of abundance as the goddess gives birth to the fruits of the earth. And so this is where you see the harvesting, the celebrations, and people are fed and nourished, and you start to see people harvesting for the time to come. So then, and that's again, the midpoint between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox. So then we hit the autumn equinox, and the sun god essentially sacrifices himself, right? So, we all know the story by this point. There's the sacrifice. He sacrifices his life as the harvest lord, and therefore he's providing life again through the harvest. But at this point, he travels to the underworld, and he is then away from the goddess. And so she, at this point, goes and searches for him. Now, in this mythos, it's a little bit different at this point, because at this point, she actually goes to the underworld to look for her lost lover, which I think is a very romantic idea. And there's also, it's starting to get colder, that kind of thing. And then at Samhain, when the veil is thin, and we're in between, there's that thinness where we can slip in between the worlds, between, the underworld and the other world. And they have a chance to finally reunite in the underworld. She finds him he's in the underworld, right? So, and that's when they are reunited, and she is impregnated again in the darkness. And so from this point, from Samhain, as we move back into through to Yule, again, like there's that coldness, the nights are getting longer, and we're coming up to this winter solstice where he will be reborn. So she essentially is living through this pregnancy in the underworld, and she gives birth in this darkness to the sun god. And then the story cycles again, right? So a lot of that's familiar. We've heard that story a couple of times. What I love about this story in how it refers to paganism, because a lot of times when we go through the wheel of the year, and if anybody has like done some research on the wheel of the year, or even they haven't and they're just somewhat familiar with the story, I like this version because the goddess seeks him out. And so in this story, when he's young and has started to gain his strength, he actually seeks her out. And then they're united, they come together, and then they're separated because he sacrificed himself. And then she seeks him out. And I think that's a part that you don't really hear often, is that she goes and seeks him out and joins him in the darkness. I don't know. I think it's kind of romantic, but that's just me.
I completely agree. I'm right there with you. To have her seek him out, especially in the underworld, it's very much a romantic gesture,
Yeah,
and it does play on the somewhat quote unquote darker side of romance. Uh,
right. Very true.
but like that's just one of those things like that drives me even is whenever it comes to romantic gestures and so on and so forth, having that sacrifice that you make to then be able to attain what it is that you truly want. And I just love it. It's wonderful.
I think so too. And I feel like it balances the playing field a little bit because he seeks her out and then she seeks him out. So it's not like the chase, so to say, isn't one-sided. Um, it feels very much equal, which I feel like it should be. Um, because again, it goes back to the idea of balance. I also like that it shows not just his time in the sun and in the light, but it also highlights his time in the darkness.
Yes.
And I think that's a point that we sometimes forget. Um, and of course, you know, the next one we're going to talk about the goddess, so we'll touch on the points for her side as well. But a lot of times when we think about masculinity and gods and the sun god and just divine masculine in general, we often think about the active principle, the sun, you know, the driving forces and that kind of thing. But I think even, you know, men have an opportunity where, or should have opportunity. I think that's kind of lost in this day and age on both sides, light and dark. But, you know, men have their dark side too. And there's not necessarily anything wrong or bad about it. It's just finding the balance. Like you have to have time on both sides to really understand yourself and discover who you are. Um, and what I like is you see the two of them, the god and the goddess, together in both. You see them both in the light, you see them both in the dark. And that's something that you just don't really see. And I think it just brings a greater opportunity to think about what that can mean, what that represents, and what that represents for us as individuals as we look at these qualities and ideas of divine masculine.
Yeah. Like for sure. And honestly, as far as being able to have time in that darkness, um, whether it's both men or women, you know, both men and women chasing each other kind of thing, having that balance, it is very much needed. But one of the things that we have a tendency to forget, especially with the masculine nature is like you, as you said, we cannot put it forward all the time.
Right.
When we are being, our masculine selves, we are projecting this energy of confidence and air of just capability and strength to try and hold things together. But we need time to rest.
Definitely.
And, it's definitely been one of those things that in this day and age, we don't even get that.
Right.
And that's anybody who's tapping into their masculine, anybody who says that they, have to constantly be strong for everybody around them. You give yourself no time to rest. Um, and though, yes, strength is one of the attributes and traits to masculinity and divine masculinity, it actually goes along with using that strength in a way to nurture as well.
Yeah.
And being able to nurture through that strength, you also have to understand that you have to take care of you too. And do not be afraid to tell somebody, it's time for me time.
Right.
I'm constantly doing for everybody else. It's time for me to take time for myself and to sit with that and be okay with it.
Right.
That actually touches point on another aspect that I feel like people who dwell in masculinity don't actually give themselves or don't understand that they're doing it. And it's that, how do I put this? I had it and it left me,
Oh no.
but it's that understanding that you don't have to do for everybody.
Right.
You pick and choose. Just because, somebody calls you up and says, "Hey, I've got this problem," whether it's work, a friend, a family member, "Hey, I've got this problem. I could really use your help." If you are stressed, if you are dealing with anything that this would actually hinder you, then understand it is okay to be like, "Sorry, I can't."
Right.
Don't be aggressive about it and be like, "Well, I need help with this and that," because then we
Right.
start we start entering the world of toxicity. Um, and we don't want to be there.
No.
Um, but like it is okay to say no, and there are going to be people that get upset with that. That is okay. Let people get mad. I One of the things that I had to learn is that it is okay to piss people off just because you're doing for you and you've stood up for yourself and you've started taking care of yourself. Other people may just get upset about it and be mad because you're no longer putting yourself out there for them to use. You're no longer their tool. You're no longer making things easier on them.
Right.
But it's okay to take care of yourself. It is okay to tell people no. We really don't have to do that. And that's actually what makes being able to do these things more of a divine trait than just standard traits. When we take the time to take care of ourselves, we start figuring out what our strengths are, how we can fully help others without causing any kind of aggravation or hindrance to anyone else, and we play to our capabilities, our strengths. And
Yeah.
not everybody's not everybody's strengths are the same. You know, you might be physically strong, you might be mentally strong, you might be emotionally strong, you might be spiritually strong. Let's go ahead and throw that one out there too, because that's a necessity at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, being able to utilize your personal strengths and show that you are strong in that way while also being able to take care of yourself is a whole different ball game.
Yeah. And, sometimes even like the flips of that, being able to set those boundaries and say no to things, um, even though some people might get upset about that, it gives people a chance to see for themselves if they're going to sink or swim in that situation. And so it's almost like you're giving other people the opportunity to be strong for themselves.
Exactly.
Some people will be able to, and some people won't. But either way, that's not your responsibility. It's not something for you to take on. And I think the main thing that we're dancing around here is basically self-love. And I feel like self-love is considered a feminine aspect or a feminine trait, like, oh, like only women do that or whatever. But that's not true at all. Like the God sacrificed himself, yes, but he had to then, because he did something so taxing, let's put it that way, he had to then go be by himself for a while. He was by himself before, he was able to tap into, as a male, his feminine nature to be receptive and able to receive her and her energy at that point. Like he had to, like he just exerted himself or, used up all of his strength. Then he got knocked down. Like, he was down for the count by himself. And he used that time, obviously, to nurture himself and prepare for what was to come. But it also was that point in time where he had to like be with himself and essentially tap into some of those more self-loving aspects. So that when she did finally find him, he was able to, I mean, when we look at some of that trade-off, like, yes, he received her energy in, like he allowed her in to become close to him. And they had their exchange, which then led to him being able to be born again. But you have to take that time. And I think that's a thing that's sometimes forgotten. Like there are masculine and feminine qualities in both males and females. And that's by design, actually, I feel like. I think that's part of the divine plan. Like that's the makeup of what makes us us. Like, to be born, it took a male and a female. And we took on qualities of both, regardless of, what our genes did and what our DNA did and how we came out the womb. It took both qualities for us to be made. And so, some people express more on their masculine side, whether they're male or female, and some express more their feminine side, whether they're male or female. And there's nothing wrong with either one. It's just learning to find the balance and, being okay with the balance, being okay with figuring out who you are and hitting that pause and going in the darkness, to sit by yourself and figure out who you are so that you can, like you said, discover your strengths, discover who you are so that you can then bring that highest and best to the table when you're reborn, when you come back, when you rise again. So yeah, none of these themes are really new in terms of religion and spirituality, but it might be new in how you're thinking about these things and what their true meanings are and how you can actually incorporate them into your life. So on that note, maybe we can talk about different aspects of divine masculine. On the more masculine side, and then maybe we could also give a few examples of what the more feminine aspects of the masculine are, they're on that same pole. They're just different
Yeah.
ends of the spectrum, but we, are constantly moving between the two.
Well, again, that also goes to show like the what we've already talked about is like that strength and that power,
Mm-hmm.
but also that nurturing side. You can nurture through all of that. So
Yeah.
yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. That's because it goes in line with another concept that I had. Um, but so when we talk about masculinity, we talk about more projective traits, things that are projected out, put out there more, put more forward in your day to day lives.
Right.
Um,
The very
and
active principles.
yes, very active principles. So things like strength, which we've already covered, but you know, taking action, being more logical, and
Yes.
being rational, being very rational. So using logic and reasoning to
Yeah.
come to conclusions.
Right.
Uh, so this, you know, it obviously goes into what we would consider our brain power. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so when you were little and you were told to put your thinking cap on, you're actually being told to tap into your masculine traits and give yourself the ability to think and pull forward and produce some thought that went along with whatever it was that you were learning. I don't know if they still do thinking caps now, but
I don't know either.
um, oh, that makes me feel so old. But you know, it's one of those things. Whether it's a math problem or some life problem, if you dwell in your masculine energy, you usually have a tendency to go about things more logically and try and rationalize situations.
Now,
Um,
just so like we're clear, because I don't want people attacking us like, oh, women can think logically. Like, yes, women can, but
I,
it is tapping into that masculine energy when you're doing it, because typically, if we're looking again at traits, um, women typically live in the state of, at least feminine women typically live in the state of emotional decisions
mhm,
versus logical decisions. Men typically make more logical decisions, women make more um, emotional decisions. Granted, again, this is not the end all be all the time. We're saying within us, we can have both, right? So when we're using the logical side, we're using that masculine aspect. When we're using the emotional side, we're using the more feminine aspect, which men also do. I mean, I think you see that a lot, especially when you see, I love it when you see like, really big, bulky, like almost scary looking, like bulked up, beefy men, right? And then you
yeah,
hand them a
like
baby.
like the
And
biker
then,
dudes,
yeah, like big
big,
biker dudes, big burly
big
biker
biker
dudes. And
dudes that you
yeah,
see at a dive bar out in the middle of freaking nowhere with their, motorcycle club or whatever.
right.
And
Or even just like some of the most hardened men that you can think of, right? Like, doesn't matter. You hand them a baby, you watch them melt. Their feminine side just goes think, turns on, even if it's just for a minute, sometimes longer. You see that feminine aspect start to come out, and it's like, oh, look at this, and some of them will even do like the baby talk, and they'll start to tickle them and try to get them to laugh, and they're wanting to like get that joy from them and like see them smile, and that's the feminine side. That's them tapping into that emotion. And
mhm.
um yeah, I mean, it everybody has both sides, but I think that's a good example. And then especially if it's the father of that child or the
Oh yeah,
grandfather of the child, you're going to see that amped up. and then like you'll see that nurturing side come out. Like, like if they trip and fall, it's, oh my God, like,
Oh,
oh
that
no.
is like my dad when my son was born. My dad was a very logical man, was all about intelligence and making sure that he had the highest IQ in the room and that people knew it. Um, but when my son was born and he finally got to hold my son for the first time, I sat there and watched my dad for 15 minutes just stare at my son and melt.
Mm-hmm. That happens.
And it's like this is a man who I don't even really know how to describe him. Um he just he was not a very emotional person when around me and my brothers. Um and around most people he just focused primarily on logic and reasoning, and but as soon as he got my son in his hands, he just stared at him for a solid 15 minutes, just melting into him like he you could not see anything but love and awe on his face
Yeah.
during that time. He didn't talk to him. He didn't have to. He just melted.
Yeah. You could see
And
it.
you could see it, you could feel it in the air. You just knew what was happening. And that is very much on that more feminine aspect for being able to sit there in it and not even have to project it.
Right.
That that's what I'm feeling.
Right.
Um, I mean, we could talk about all the different emotions and talk about the masculine and feminine aspects of both of them, or of every emotion. We won't get into that. That is a lot.
It is.
um, but again, everybody has, and I want to make sure we make that very clear through this episode and the next episode. Everyone has masculine and feminine in them. We are
Definitely.
all balanced. We are
Yes.
all balanced.
It's finding that balance. And like, you know, sometimes you do like, so I want to mention something before we dive into the subject of like the toxic masculinity that we see. You can see even before it gets to a toxic level, like you can see um, there start to be an unbalance. Like even before it gets toxic, just there's that tip of the iceberg where you start to see unbalance in that masculine side. And you can see it in both men and women, but it's any time that you're pushing too hard. You're physically exhausting yourself by go, 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 push, 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 do, have to accomplish, have to make these things happen, have to do all, be all for everybody. Like you mentioned before, like going to that point of physical exhaustion and even mental exhaustion for that point. That is when you're really starting to go into that unhealthy, unbalanced version of being too masculine. And again, that's where you have to find that balance of bringing it back out by evening it back out by, taking that time to relax, to rest. Because if you don't, then you can start to run into some of the more toxic masculine traits. I mean, and I'm not even talking about the extreme ones here. I'm just talking about, um, being so exhausted that you're in pain, then you're angry, you're snapping, you're yelling, you're lashing out, um, you're blaming people around you for your decisions because you pushed yourself too hard, but yet you want to blame everybody else for not doing enough, but you didn't ask for help. You didn't ask anybody to participate. You didn't ask anybody to do anything. You just had to do it all, right? And so those more toxic traits start to come out when you get those warning signs like, hey, you're pushing too much, time to reel it in, time to get balanced. Like, I get having to meet deadlines, but you don't want to go so far as to get to that toxic level. And then you want to make sure that you give yourself the downtime to recover, um, have some of that self-love care, move into some of the more feminine side of, yourself, so that you can recover before you feel like you have to go push and do the next thing. Like, your brain needs that, your physical body needs that rest. It's very, very important. So, um, yeah, I just want to throw that out there. So, like, those are some of your warning signs of like you've gone too far.
Yeah. Well, and one of the again, one of the big things that we run into here is toxic masculinity happens.
Oh, it does.
It happens. We In a lot of cases we cannot control it at times because again, we are pushed to our limits. There may even be times where we have asked for help and those people that I was talking about that have the ability to say no do.
Right.
They could be at their limit and know that, but you're having to deal with a lot more that is coming into your life, and you feel it necessary to just take on the load. I am bad about that myself. I am extremely bad about that myself. I feel like I have to take on the load for everyone and just kind of help lift them up and raise them up and make sure that they're doing good. And, it's that mentality of, well, as long as they're okay, I'll be okay. That is not always true
No.
because there will always be someone else that you feel needs to
Right.
be okay before you take care of yourself.
Right.
This again causes that irritation, that agitation that turns into aggression, that snappy nature, and people trying to figure out, well, you were so nice. Why are you being so mean now?
Right. Right.
And if you don't realize what's going on, then you're going to be like, I'm not being mean. I'm just
Right.
dealing with a lot of stuff. And you're still
You,
being snappy. You're still,
yeah, you can definitely become blind to it, I think, because it becomes habitual. And then it's like you don't even realize that you're doing it. And that's when it gets really dangerous, because you're not only then hurting other people, you're also hurting yourself.
yep.
Um, and that's like the light side, obviously, of
Yeah,
the
that's,
toxic side of masculinity. Like, that's the lighter stuff. I mean, I think over time, like, I don't think anybody is inherently born or raised necessarily. Like, I think there's pressure. But I don't think anybody is born being a toxic masculine person like it's used today in society. Like, I don't think people are born that way. I don't think people are, taught to be that way. I think it happens over not knowing how to be balanced. I think it comes from a lot of outside pressure, whether that's parental pressure or societal pressure, um, or things that have happened to people in their lifetime. Like, I just don't think people are like inherently born bad or evil. Like,
I will have to say that it can be taught. It can
yeah, I mean,
be
I think it
generational.
can be, but I don't know that if it's like, I think in some aspects it can be like people can be pressured into feeling like they have to be super masculine, like boys can't cry, and um,
We'll touch on that here shortly
like
because
that
the
kind of
world
stuff.
pressures us into that. That's
Right,
the the culture that we're seeing today, where we have a lot of mental health issues and so on and so forth, actually comes from that very pressure.
Right.
We see a lot of unalivings that happen, self unalivings that happen, um, because of that pressure.
Right.
You have to be, in order to be a man, quote unquote, you have to be this way. You have to do this. You have to present yourself this way. You can't show this. You can't be that. And we're also now seeing the other side of it where people have finally gotten fed up with that and have been like, no, I'm me. I'm going to be me.
Right.
And I will be proud to be me.
I think what we're seeing, so I would say before 20 years ago, I would say yes, very much that was the push in society as a on a larger scale. I think that pressure to still be a man, tough it up, don't cry, like I think that still exists in places. But I think between like social media and just the media in general and the way the world is shifting, I feel like in the last 20 years, there's been a lot more of a push for men to become more feminine, actually, is what I'm seeing in the younger
Yeah.
generations over the last like 20 to 30 years. Cause I see like, men in their like early mid 20s and younger, and they're much more in tune with their feminine aspects, but I almost wonder if the scales tipped a little bit too far, where
Well, yeah,
there's even still not a balance.
it's not balanced. We're seeing the two extremes come out. We're
Right,
still trying to find the balance.
right.
Um,
And I think it comes from, the whole thought and idea of toxic masculinity. For a long time that wasn't a thing, or at least it wasn't labeled as such. And then there was this big boom and focus on toxic masculinity. And so I think it had the younger generations saying, oh, well, I definitely don't want to be that. I'm going to go to the far extreme. And I think that's, as humans, I think that's just our nature to say, oh, if I don't want to be that, I need to be the exact opposite,
complete
instead of saying,
100%
what's the
opposite.
balance? Where's the middle ground?
Yeah.
I mean, you see that a lot with parenting. Like if you have super strict parents, then those kids are like, well, I'm not going to be that. And then they end up being really light-handed. And then like, hopefully those kids are like, well, you didn't discipline us at all. That's crazy cakes. Like I'm going to discipline my kid, but hopefully they like land somewhere in between in that balance. I hope in the next 20, 30 years that people will finally come to some kind of balance, and fall
It,
somewhere in the middle.
it will get there. It will get there eventually. But again, what we're seeing is the scales where we've had one side loaded down for so long to try and balance it out. All this weight's been thrown on the other side, and now we're seeing
Right.
this number.
Right.
Um, and so that back and forth. So again, as I said, we've got both sides still showing.
Yeah.
So you've got this extreme over here where, oh, I don't need to be masculine because all masculinity is toxic,
Right. Right. I think that's where it's landed.
versus I still have to be a man. I can't show emotion
Right.
because if I do, then this is going to happen and I'm going to be seen as weak and yada, yada, yada.
We definitely still have
So,
people alive, quite a few still, thankfully, that are still in that mindset. And then you still have the few younger ones here and there that are like seeing these scales wobbling, and they're like, well, I think I need to go to this side because this side's now too heavy. And it's like, no, land somewhere in the middle.
like,
Just be you. Like, it's okay to be masculine. It's okay to be feminine too. It's okay to have both and be in the middle for who and what works for you. Um, because not all masculinity is toxic. And you see this in women as well. I mean, if you look at the women's movements of trying to fight for rights and that kind of thing, like there was a heavy push in women tapping into their masculine side of taking action, being proactive, fighting for rights, these kind of things. Where prior to that, society very much pushed that women were in the home, they were homemakers, they cooked, they cleaned, they sewed their own clothes, they made clothes for their family, like they were meant to be in the home, and very nurturing, attending to everything. I mean, I'm just gonna throw this out. It doesn't seem like men did a lot. They basically didn't do shit back then. Like the women did like they went to work. Like I once read a pamphlet literally about how to be a good wife. I think it was from like, I don't know, the 40s or some shit. And it was like, make sure the children are well dressed and fed and in their bedrooms when the father comes home so that he doesn't have to mentally deal with the children. And do not talk to him about problems when he gets home until after he has had an hour to relax and his dinner has been fed to him and things have been cleaned up. You reserve any kind of talks or business or anything that you need until hours after he's come home so as not to mentally stress him out. Like, bitch, you just been cleaning that house all day, keeping up with him. You are stressed out. Like, that motherfucker needs to pick up the load when you get home so you can have a break. I don't think so. But that's not how it was. You know what I mean? Like,
Well,
it was
okay,
very
hold on, because again, we're looking at it from today.
right. That's true. Like back then it
We
was the norm.
like, well, not only was it the norm back then, but you also have to think, when were 40-hour work weeks actually put into play?
Oh, that I don't
How
remember. I do remember. I remember reading on it, but I can't remember the exact dates.
how many
I
how
think it was
many
like in the 20s,
times
20s or 30s when they started to like actually regulate work hours and
yeah, sometime around 1920, 1930, I believe it was, and I believe it in part had to do with Henry Ford. I need to look back up the history on it.
yeah. Yeah.
I did not expect us to get into this topic, so I was not prepared on that end. But so again, like one of the big things is you had coal miners
Right.
who were working, you know, 10, 12 hours in a coal mine from before the sun came up till after the sun went down. At one point,
I think that whole era as a push in society, I think everybody was living in a highly masculine world.
yes, it
Because not only were like the men doing a lot, the women were too. And it was like a constant push. And I think it's when we have those eras when we're living in that masculine energy that we have really big breakthroughs and we push forward as a society into new areas. Um, and then I feel like come like the 40s and 50s, things started to kind of balance out because we did see the the more work hours that made more sense. They weren't as strenuous. And then, but I'm not sure how much the workload like started to come off of women, which is
so
when women were like, we got to push forward for rights.
right. And see, this is what happened. So by the 40s and 50s, because it was the 1960s when we started having women's suffrage and women's rights movements and all that, correct? Especially after World War II,
Right.
where women were doing most of the industrial work
Right.
here.
Everything was a very masculine push forward.
Right.
Do
So
you do?
so what we ended up seeing is, after this massive workload that the men had on them, that they were being forced to work for, even up to 16, 24 hours at a time before being able to even get time off.
Yeah, it was.
Now, now we've got rules and regulations, laws in place that force them to now come home. This allows them time to relax after all these generations of go kill yourself in the mines kind of thing.
Right.
Um, and then now
Times were
it's
just fucking hard.
yeah, now it's their time to sit down, relax, yada yada yada, because they don't have to work as much. But then we have the alternate side of things where women are still being forced into doing all these things for men. And so instead of understanding like nowadays,
I
we
was on
need
a
to
whole train of
even
thought with this. Like the whole thing was like we push like women had to push for like the masculine for their rights, right? Like we had that push and then I feel like then we went into like the hippies, right? And every like there was still some unbalance and you started to see the more separating, right?
yeah,
Of like it's all like love and peace and and there was a lot of men and women involved in that, but then there was also like no, like we're fighting this war and Vietnam's going on and you have
yep,
these people still feeling like they have to be really masculine and they're expected to go serve for their country. So we have these polarities still like separating over time. And some are on the more feminine aspect, some are on the more masculine aspect. And then, as women were gaining their rights, they could, we saw that relaxing, right?
yep,
Um, and then we move into um, like the 80s and 90s, where, now it's men and women are both working.
mhm,
And, it's not, now there's like this push all of a sudden of everybody has to be active, everybody has to be tapped into their masculine, like everybody is still go, go, go.
yep,
And we have these like constant fluxes. And then I feel like, you know, the 2000s, I feel like were a I don't want to say balance. Like there was still a lot of things going on behind the scenes that weren't great, which led us into where
yep.
we ended up with the toxic masculinity coming out.
Yeah, it was a bit more of a lull. So again, we have those highs, we have those lows, and then we
Right,
always have those in betweens.
right, right.
Um,
Like it seemed like things were okay, but really they weren't. Like it was underground. And then when it all came to surface, there was this big boom of this toxic masculinity, these men that were just exerting themselves where they weren't wanted and,
it
being
brings me
controlling, domineering,
it
abusive,
brings me to
sexually
another point.
abusive, all of these things.
Yeah, it brings me to another point though of as long as human beings exist and have the ability to think for themselves, there will always be conflicting ideals.
Oh, yeah.
And
It's just
so,
the way that life works, the
you know,
world works.
we talk about wanting world peace and so on and so forth. The ideal euphoric world would be that nobody's ever at war and everybody's okay with everybody else.
Can't we just all get along?
Yeah, that it is a wonderful thing to dream about. It is a wonderful thing to think about. However, we are human. We think with our own brains, we come to our own conclusions, and we will disagree with people. That's how it works.
Well, I think even if there was peace, like people would not agree on what peace meant.
Right. Well, see, and
Like
that's the thing. That's like,
that's full, yeah, like everybody's definition of everything is just it's just not the same. Like Webster should have just hung it up forever ago because like everybody comes up with their own definition, especially nowadays. And it's just I don't know, like people just have so many different opinions. Um, but when you feel the need to push your opinion on somebody, that's where we fall into that toxic masculinity.
that's where we're leading into here, uh, as far as like with the traits of toxic masculinity.
Right.
So, as you stated, some certain aggressions. There's that sexual aggression, there's standard physical aggression, emotional aggression, um, violent tendencies. Let's see, what else have I got written down? Um, and sexual objectification. Um, plus many, many, many more other
Yes.
things that have been classified as toxic masculinity. So,
And I want to
and
state too, it's not just men that do these things.
no,
Women are also very guilty of doing these things as well. I think it's just not as frequently heard about, but it definitely exists because again, it's when a woman is tapping into that masculine energy, because again, everybody has both. But when they let it take over and go too far, they are just as guilty of these things.
I have
I'm
the
sorry. I see
perfect,
some women and they're with some men, and you're just like, dang, I know she beats the crap out of him every night. You could just tell. Like,
well, I have one of the perfect things that would show it. And the fact is that it's ironic. Okay. Go look up these videos of women going absolute batshit about toxic masculinity. Tell me that that's not toxic masculinity.
well, yeah, because they're tapping into that masculine trait.
Right.
That's the whole
They
thing.
feel
Like
this
taking it to the
absolute,
extreme.
yeah, they feel this absolute need to push this and say that this is toxic masculinity and there's no way to fix it, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, they are going insane. And I'm like, you realize what you're doing is toxic masculinity, right? Like, you you refuse to actually take the time to calm down, understand that you're pushing too hard here, you're being overly aggressive, which is a toxic masculine trait,
Right.
and you can't be told otherwise.
Right.
Or, in other words, you're being hard headed and stubborn, which again is a toxic masculine trait.
Right. Well, I mean, you even have, I mean, there are even women out there that are very sexually forward with men,
Hmm.
and it's unsolicited. They did not ask for that. They did not ask to be, you know, to have that. Like they weren't flirting. They didn't invite it. Anything like you see that, and you also see women being sexually aggressive with other women as well. I mean, that's a thing as well. Like you have to look at all sides of it. I mean, I even think, I mean, and when we talk about toxic masculinity, I think, just because of the world I live in, initially, yes, I'm going to think it's a man against a woman. But when you step back and actually think about what does it mean? What are the signs? What are the symptoms? It can be a man against a man. It can be a woman against a man. And it can be a woman against a woman. It can be anybody that is tapping into those masculine traits and taking it too far. I mean, that's essentially what it is. Like, just the big societal focus was on men, but it doesn't just exist for men. And I think we just need to remember that and try to look at it as a whole, taking a step back and looking in. And then, because until you're aware of what it is, um, you can't do anything to help somebody, and you can't do anything to help yourself to improve if you're not willing to at least step back and look at it.
Correct.
If we only associate it with men, we could be leaving other men and women who are having it done to them, out of the picture. You might think, oh, well, that's a guy. He'd never be a victim of toxic masculinity from somebody else. He absolutely could be.
Oh,
But
yeah.
if you're not open to see that, you know, you don't know how to help. You don't know how to offer help.
And if I, I also want to go ahead and throw this out there. If you are a victim of any of this, please, please reach out to proper authorities.
Yeah.
If you are a victim and it's from the past and you still deal with, issues from that, please seek
Right.
help.
Yeah, any PTSD, things like that, definitely seek out some counseling or therapy, um, because it's hard to recover from those things, especially alone. Sometimes you need somebody, a professional, to walk you through it.
Yep.
And you can always support that magically. You can do your magical things to support it, but if it's something that you're struggling with, definitely seek out a professional to talk to.
Well, and I also have to say that, like, there is magic in words. The healing power of talking about something is in and of itself truly magical. So
Right.
being able to find somebody that you feel you can talk to and find somebody that you know will listen, just so that you can get it off your chest,
Right.
get rid of it, and be done with it. It's healing, it's magical, it helps tremendously, and I know this from experience. Um, we are over our hour mark.
We
Uh,
are.
so, one of the last things that I do want to really quickly talk about is one thing that we haven't mentioned, um, and it is the flip side of the toxic masculinity trait of aggression, um, and that is protection. So, one of the biggest traits of what we would call divine masculinity is a protective nature. Now, this also can be toxic if pushed, because then it goes into the form of controlling and so on and so forth. But one of the things that we will see, that you do see in a lot of people that are tapped into their masculinity and their divine masculinity, is a need to protect, a willingness to, again, put themselves in harm's way to protect others. Um, and so if you see somebody or know somebody that has stepped into an altercation of a stranger to protect somebody else, they're actually putting forth that divine masculinity in that instance. Um, it does not mean we need to do it. If you do not feel comfortable doing it, do what you can to help, aka call somebody, you know, draw attention away from it or to it, depending on what it is. Um, but, it doesn't mean you have to jump in, but being a protector is one of the keys to understanding a more controlled and divine masculine state. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, you see it again in that Wheel of the Year mythos when you see um, the god essentially sacrifice himself so that humanity can continue to live, be nurtured, have food, survive. I mean, he's essentially protecting them by sacrificing himself. I mean, so definitely, I think it's a divine masculine quality. Um, and again, you have, like, when you think of, like, let's just put all gods aside, whether they're pagan, Christian, whatever, right? Like, what is your, as an individual, right? Like, ask yourself this question: what would be your ideal um, picture and qualities of a god? Because I think a lot of people struggle with connecting with God, especially Christians, because the Bible can be so confusing. And at one point, he's all, very angry and hateful. And then the next, he's like all loving, and I'm sacrificing my kid for you people, like, I don't know. It's like, it's a whole mix. So let's just cut all that out, right? Like, what would be your ideal God? Like, for me, it would be somebody who's protective. I want to know that my God is protecting me, that he's providing for me, he's looking out for me, that he acts on my behalf, he takes actions on my behalf, that I would hope that he would make a clear path for me to follow, things like that. So yeah, I mean, if you're having a hard time connecting to the idea of a God or divine masculine, just like, what, if you could make up your own, like, what qualities would you want them to have? And I think it's just a start, to trying to connect with that aspect if it's something that's difficult for you to do. Like, I know for me, it was difficult to connect to a goddess energy because I was raised Christian. And then it was difficult for me to connect with pagan gods because I was raised to have this idea and concept of the Hebrew God, right? So it took a while for me to let all of that go and let the ideas of this Hebrew God and Jesus and all this stuff go, so I could just experience who and what God and the divine masculine is without all the preconceived notions and, my past history playing into it. And once I did that, I was like, oh, this is fucking cool.
Yes. Oh, and for a lot of people, I feel like the one true God mythos, that is constantly thrown around by multiple different faiths. When you go into pagan culture and the lifestyle of a pagan, it can be very, very difficult to connect with any deity, masculine or feminine, god or goddess. It becomes very difficult just to get past that, because again, you're so focused on that almost bitterness that you have towards a deity mythos in general, but then you're also fighting yourself on the, well, all I've ever learned about is the one true God. Um, it takes time, it takes patience, it takes practice, it takes a willingness to persevere, um, and to study and learn, um, to be able to potentially make a connection. Um,
And we are going to do, just for everybody, we are going to do a follow-up episode on just working with the God and goddess. So you might find that helpful if this was like got you thinking about things and you're like, I want to know more. Like, how do I connect? What do I do? How do I interact? Those kinds of things. We will be doing a follow-up episode for that. So stay
yes,
tuned,
we will
and we
get
will
there.
talk more about those particular aspects. But hopefully this has given you a good starting point, some things to think about. And if you have any questions or comments, we are open to that, especially regarding the divine masculine or any other questions you might have. Feel free to reach out. You can email me at thewitchsource@gmail.com. Let me know if it's okay to share your name and or your question on an episode, so I know if that's okay or not. And we would be glad to answer your question as best we can. So aside from that, make sure you are subscribing, following, all that good jazz. Leave us a good review. If you're listening on a podcast somewhere, tell your friends about it. We appreciate it. And yeah, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, all podcast places where you can listen, YouTube. What am I missing? The website, thewitchsource.com.
There you go.
And you can also come check us out. We are at The Witch Source, 1622 South Hawthorne Road, Suite 7 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So stop by and say hi.
If you're lucky, I might be there. If not, then you're still going to run into awesome people. So
True. Very true. All right, you guys. Until next time, we hope you enjoy. And yeah, till then, stay magical. Bye.
bye.